The summer of 1925 arrived at Camp Wildwood with the same promise it had carried for 27 years: adventure, friendship, and memories that would last a lifetime. Thomas Mitchell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and wiped the sweat from his brow as he descended into the musty basement of the main lodge. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight, each step echoing through the cramped space filled with decades of camp memorabilia. As the newest counselor at 24, Thomas had volunteered for the thankless task of organizing the camp's archives. Boxes upon boxes of photographs, letters, and documents lay scattered across makeshift tables, creating a maze of forgotten summers. The air hung thick with dust and the scent of aging paper, while a single bare bulb cast dancing shadows across the concrete walls. 14 years of this place, Thomas muttered to himself, examining a water-damaged ledger from 1911. You'd think they'd have kept better records. Outside, the sounds of summer drifted through the small basement windows, boys laughing as they played Capture the Flag, the distant splash of someone cannonballing into the lake, and the sharp blast of a whistle, signaling the end of afternoon activities. Thomas envied them their carefree existence, remembering his own summers at camps like this one, where the biggest worry was avoiding kitchen duty. He picked up a metal strongbox, its brass corners green with age. A faded label read, "Time Capsule, Summer 1911. Do not open until 1925. Thomas chuckled at the coincidence. 14 years had passed exactly, and here he was, the unwitting recipient of some long-ago camper's buried treasure. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a protesting squeal. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a collection of items that seemed ordinary enough: a wooden whistle, a few coins, a boy's leather journal with pages yellowed by time, and at the bottom, a single photograph. Thomas lifted the photograph carefully, noting how well preserved it was despite its age. The image showed 4 boys, each appearing to be about 14 years old, working together to lift a wooden canoe above their heads. The lake stretched behind them, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the overhanging pine branches. The boys' faces were clear and sharp, one with dark hair and serious eyes, another with a gap-toothed grin, a third with freckles dotting his cheeks, and the last with an athletic build and confident posture. What struck Thomas immediately was how familiar they looked. He'd seen these faces before, but that was impossible. This photograph was 14 years old, taken when he was barely 10 himself. The basement door opened above, flooding the stairs with afternoon sunlight. "Mr. Mitchell?" called a young voice. "Are you down there?" "Coming, David," Thomas replied, recognizing the voice of one of his campers. He slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket and climbed the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under his feet. David Brennan stood in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from the afternoon's activities, his serious brown eyes watching Thomas with curiosity. Behind him stood 3 other boys: Marcus O'Sullivan with his characteristic gap-toothed smile, Samuel Pierce with his constellation of freckles, and Jonathan Hayes, whose athletic frame filled out his camp uniform perfectly. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. These were the exact 4 boys from the 1911 photograph. "We were wondering if we could help with anything down there," David said, his voice carrying the same earnest tone Thomas had noticed since the boys arrived 3 weeks ago. "We finished our cabin cleanup early." That's very thoughtful of you," Thomas managed, his voice catching slightly. He studied their faces more carefully now, noting every detail. The way Marcus unconsciously covered his gap when he smiled, how Samuel's freckles seemed to dance when he laughed, the confident way Jonathan stood with his shoulders back. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Mitchell?" Samuel asked, his head tilting to one side. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase hit Thomas like a physical blow. Had he seen a ghost? 4 ghosts? But these boys were solid, real, casting shadows in the afternoon sun streaming through the lodge windows. They breathed, they laughed, they complained about the food, just like every other camper. "I'm fine," Thomas said, forcing a smile. "Just tired from all that dusty work downstairs. Why don't you boys head down to the lake for evening swim? I'll catch up with you in a few minutes." The 4 boys exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them that Thomas couldn't interpret. Then David nodded. "Sure thing, Mr. Mitchell. We'll see you down there." As they walked away, Thomas heard Marcus say something about the water being perfect today, and Jonathan laughing about yesterday's canoe race. Normal camp conversation, the kind he'd heard 1,000 times before. Thomas waited until they disappeared around the corner before pulling the photograph from his pocket with trembling hands. In the clear afternoon light, there was no denying it. The faces were identical, not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same, down to the last freckle on Samuel's nose and the exact angle of David's serious expression. He flipped the photograph over and found something written in faded pencil. Summer 1911. David, Marcus, Samuel, Jonathan, the four who remain. Thomas's hands shook as he read the words again. The four who remain. What did that mean, and how could four boys who were 14 in 1911 still be 14 in 1925? That evening, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on his usual duties. As the other counselors led campfire songs and told ghost stories, he sat on the periphery, watching the four boys with growing unease. David, Marcus, Samuel, and Jonathan participated in all the activities with the same enthusiasm as the other campers, yet something felt fundamentally different about them. When 10-year-old Billy Peterson got scared during a particularly vivid ghost story about the Headless Horseman, it was David who quietly moved to sit beside him, offering comfort without drawing attention to the younger boy's fear. Marcus kept the other boys laughing with perfectly timed jokes, while Samuel helped distribute s'mores ingredients with meticulous care. Jonathan organized an impromptu wrestling match that had everyone cheering. They were perfect campers. Too perfect. After lights out, Thomas waited until the camp settled into its nightly rhythm of crickets and distant laughter from the senior counselor's cabin. He slipped out of his bunk and made his way to the small camp office where Director Harrison kept the oldest records. If these four boys had been here in 1911, there would be documentation. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Thomas lit a kerosene lamp and began searching through filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. His fingers grew grimy with dust as he pulled out folder after folder of registration forms, medical records, and staff reports dating back to the camp's founding. Finally, in a box marked 1910-1915, he found what he was looking for. 4 registration forms, yellowed with age but still legible. David Brennan, age 14, Boston, Massachusetts. Parent guardian, St. Mary's Orphanage. Marcus O'Sullivan, age 14, New York City. Parent guardian, Catherine O'Sullivan, widow. Samuel Pierce, age 14, Albany, New York. Parent guardian, Reverend Michael Pierce. Jonathan Hayes, age 14, Buffalo, New York. Parent guardian, Hayes Family Trust. Thomas's hands trembled as he read the addresses, the emergency contacts, even the medical notes about Marcus's gap teeth and Samuel's seasonal allergies. Everything matched perfectly with the boys currently sleeping in cabin 7, but there was more. A staff report dated August 15, 1911, written in the careful handwriting of that era's camp director. The 4 boys in question, Brennan, O'Sullivan, Pierce, and Hayes, were last seen taking out a canoe after evening activities. When they failed to return for lights out, a search was organized. The canoe was found overturned near the north shore of the lake. Despite extensive searching by local authorities and volunteers from town, no bodies were recovered. The lake's unusual depth and strong undercurrents likely carried them to the deepest parts. A memorial service was held August 20th. The boys are presumed drowned. Thomas set the report down with shaking hands. Drowned. In 1911. Yet he'd just spent the evening watching them roast marshmallows and sing camp songs. A soft knock at the office door made him jump, nearly knocking over the kerosene lamp. "Mr. Mitchell?" It was David's voice, quiet and concerned. "Are you all right? We saw the light." Thomas quickly gathered the papers, his heart pounding. "I'm fine, David. Just doing some paperwork. You boys should be in bed." "We couldn't sleep," came Samuel's voice. "Sometimes the lake gets noisy at night." "Noisy?" Thomas frowned. Lake Wildwood was known for its unusual stillness, even on windy nights. He opened the door to find all 4 boys standing there in their pajamas, their faces pale in the lamplight. They looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, and Thomas felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward them. "What kind of noises?" he asked gently. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, "Like voices calling from underwater. And sometimes we hear splashing, but when we look out the cabin window, the lake is completely still." "It's probably just your imagination," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Lakes can make strange sounds at night. The water settling, fish jumping." Jonathan shook his head. "It's not fish, Mr. Mitchell. It sounds like people. People calling for help." The 4 boys exchanged glances again. That same unspoken communication Thomas had noticed earlier. There was something they weren't telling him, something that frightened them. "Have you boys ever been to Camp Wildwood before this summer?" Thomas asked carefully. David's expression became guarded. "No, sir. This is our first time. Why do you ask?" "No reason. Just curious." Thomas studied their faces, looking for any sign of deception, but found only genuine confusion. "Well, you should get back to bed. Tomorrow's canoe day, and you'll want to be well rested." At the mention of canoes, all 4 boys went rigid. The color drained from their faces so completely that Thomas thought they might faint. "Actually," David said quickly, "we were thinking of skipping the water activities tomorrow. Maybe help in the craft cabin instead." "We don't really like being on the lake," Samuel added, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas found this strange. In his 3 weeks at camp, he'd never seen 4 boys more naturally drawn to the water. They were excellent swimmers, skilled at handling canoes, and seemed most at peace when they were near the lake shore. "That's fine," Thomas said, "but if you change your minds, you know where to find me." As the boys walked back toward their cabin, Thomas heard Marcus whisper, "He knows something. Did you see how he was looking at us?" "Impossible," David replied. "No one remembers. No one ever remembers." "But what if this time is different?" Samuel's voice carried on the night air. "What if 14 years was long enough?" Thomas stood in the doorway long after the boys disappeared into the darkness, their words echoing in his mind. No one ever remembers. 14 years was long enough for what? He looked out toward the lake, its surface black as obsidian under the starless sky. Somewhere in those depths lay the answer to an impossible mystery, and Thomas was beginning to realize that some secrets refused to stay buried. The next morning brought unseasonably cold weather to Camp Wildwood. A thick mist hung over the lake like a shroud, and the temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees overnight. Thomas shivered as he made his way to the dining hall, noting how the other campers huddled in their sweaters and complained about the sudden change. But the 4 boys from Cabin 7 seemed unaffected by the cold. They sat at their usual table, wearing only their standard camp uniforms, appearing comfortable while everyone else shivered. More disturbing still, Thomas noticed they weren't eating. Their plates remained full, food untouched, though they went through the motions of cutting and lifting forks to their mouths. "Strange weather we're having," said Helen Cartwright, the camp nurse, as she joined Thomas at the staff table. She was a practical woman in her 50s who'd been at Camp Wildwood for over a decade. "Haven't seen fog this thick since I started working here." "Has it ever happened before?" Thomas asked, grateful for the distraction from his troubled thoughts. "Only once that I remember clearly. Summer of 1911, right after those 4 boys drowned. The weather turned cold and misty for nearly a week. Some of the staff thought it was the lake mourning them." Helen chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Silly superstition, of course." Thomas's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. "You were here in 1911. Heavens no, I was just a girl then. But my Aunt Sarah was the camp nurse that summer. She used to tell stories about it when I was young. How the search went on for days. How the whole camp felt haunted after it happened." Helen's expression grew somber. "Aunt Sarah always said there was something unnatural about the way those boys disappeared. The lake just swallowed them up without a trace." "What do you mean unnatural?" Helen glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "Well, all 4 boys were excellent swimmers. They knew that lake better than anyone, had been coming to camp for 3 summers running. But that night they took out a canoe after dark, which was strictly forbidden. When they found the overturned canoe, there wasn't a single personal item floating around it. No shoes, no clothing, nothing. It was as if the lake had claimed them completely." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. 3 summers running. You mean they'd been here before 1911? "Oh yes, they were practically fixtures at Camp Wildwood. David Brennan was something of a leader among the boys, always organizing activities and helping the younger campers. Marcus O'Sullivan could make anyone laugh, even during the most difficult times. Samuel Pierce was meticulous about everything, kept detailed journals about camp life, and Jonathan Hayes was probably the best athlete the camp had ever seen." Each description matched perfectly with the boys Thomas had been observing. The same personalities, the same traits, as if they'd been preserved in time like insects in amber. "My aunt always believed they were trying to reach something in the lake that night," Helen continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There were old stories about the lake, Native American legends about spirits trapped in its depths. Aunt Sarah thought maybe the boys had heard those stories and got curious." "What kind of stories?" Before Helen could answer, a commotion erupted from the campers section of the dining hall. Billy Peterson, the 10-year-old who'd been scared during last night's ghost stories, was pointing toward the windows that faced the lake, his face white with terror. "There's someone in the water," he screamed. "I can see them moving around in the fog." All the counselors rushed to the windows, but the mist was so thick that visibility extended only a few feet from shore. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, straining to see anything in the grey expanse. "I don't see anything," said Jim Bradley, the head waterfront counselor. There, Billy insisted, his voice rising to a panic. "4 people, swimming in circles. They keep going under and coming back up." Thomas's blood ran cold. He looked back at the table where David, Marcus, Samuel, and Jonathan had been sitting moments before. Their chairs were empty, their untouched plates still sitting where they'd left them. "Where did the boys from Cabin 7 go?" Thomas asked urgently. The other campers looked around, confused. "What boys?" asked a 12-year-old named Peter. "Cabin 7 is empty this summer. Has been since we got here." "No, that's not right," Thomas protested. "David, Marcus, Samuel, Jonathan, they've been here for 3 weeks." But as he looked at the faces around him, he saw only blank stares and concerned expressions. Even Helen was looking at him with worry. "Thomas, dear," she said gently, "are you feeling all right? There are only 28 campers this summer, and I know every one of them. There's no David or Marcus or Samuel or Jonathan registered." The dining hall began to spin around Thomas. This was impossible. He'd spoken to those boys, watched them participate in activities, seen them eat and laugh and tell jokes. They were real. They had to be real. "Check the records," Thomas said desperately. "Check the cabin assignments. Cabin 7. Jim Bradley pulled out his clipboard and flipped through the pages. "Cabin 7 has been closed for maintenance since the beginning of the summer. The roof leaked during the spring rains. We decided not to use it this year." Thomas staggered backward, his mind reeling. How could an entire camp forget 4 boys who'd been living among them for weeks? How could there be no record of their existence when he had clear memories of interacting with them every day? "The fog's lifting," someone called from the windows. As the mist began to dissipate, the lake's surface came into view. It was perfectly still, like black glass reflecting the grey sky. There was no sign of anyone swimming, no ripples to suggest movement of any kind. But Billy Peterson continued to point at the water, his young face etched with terror. "They're still there," he whispered. 4 boys, standing waist-deep in the water, just staring at the camp. Why can't anyone else see them? Thomas looked where Billy was pointing and felt his heart nearly stop. There, barely visible through the thinning fog, were 4 familiar silhouettes standing motionless in the lake. Even at this distance, he could make out their faces clearly. David's serious expression, Marcus's gap-toothed smile, Samuel's freckled cheeks, and Jonathan's athletic frame. They were staring directly at the dining hall windows, directly at Thomas, and their mouths were moving as if they were trying to speak. But no sound carried across the water, only the oppressive silence of the morning mist. Thomas spent the rest of the morning in a state of barely controlled panic, while the other staff members went about their normal routines. Apparently having forgotten that 4 boys had ever been at the camp, he retreated to his cabin and pulled out the leather journal he'd found in the 1911 time capsule. His hands shook as he opened to the first page, written in the careful script of a 14-year-old boy. "Summer Journal of Samuel Pierce, Camp Wildwood, 1911, 3rd year attending. This will be our last summer here, as we're getting too old for camp. David says we should make it memorable." Thomas flipped through pages of typical camp observations, complaints about the food, excitement over swimming competitions, descriptions of fellow campers and counselors. But as he read deeper, the entries became increasingly strange. July 15th. "Something's different about the lake this year. The water feels colder, and sometimes I hear voices when I swim near the center. David thinks I'm imagining things, but Marcus has heard them too." July 22nd. "Jonathan discovered something while diving for lost fishing lures. He says there's a structure down there, like an old building or foundation. When he tried to show us, we couldn't find it. The water seemed to push us away." July 28th. "The voices are getting clearer. They're calling our names, begging us to come deeper. David forbade us from swimming alone, but I can feel the pull getting stronger every day. It's like something in the lake knows us, wants us." Thomas's heart pounded as he read the final entries. August 10th. "We found the old Indian burial ground during our nature hike. Mr. Clearwater, the Mohawk guide, told us stories about the lake. He says it was sacred water, but something went wrong long ago. The spirits that should have moved on got trapped instead. He warned us to stay away from the deep water, especially at night." August 12th. "David had the dream again. All four of us are having the same dream now. We're underwater, but we can breathe. There are others with us, boys from different times, all the same age we are now. They tell us we belong with them, that we've always belonged with them. August 14th, last entry. We've decided to go tonight. The pull is too strong now, and fighting it is making us sick. David says if we're meant to be here forever, then at least we'll be together. We buried this journal and the other items in case someone needs to understand what happened to us. The lake is calling and we have to answer. Thomas dropped the journal, his mind reeling. The boys had known they'd gone into the lake willingly, drawn by some supernatural force that had been calling to them all summer. But if they'd drowned in 1911, how had they been walking around camp for the past 3 weeks? A knock at his cabin door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Billy Peterson standing there, his young face streaked with tears. "Mr. Mitchell," Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody believes me about the boys in the lake. They think I'm making it up or having nightmares. But you saw them too, didn't you?" Thomas knelt down to Billy's eye level. "Yes, Billy, I saw them." Relief flooded the boy's face. "Who are they? Why can everyone see them sometimes and not others?" "I think they're boys who got lost here a long time ago," Thomas said carefully. "And I think they need our help." Billy nodded solemnly. "They were trying to tell me something when I saw them this morning. Their mouths were moving, but I couldn't hear the words. What did it look like they were saying?" Billy scrunched up his face in concentration. It looked like "help us" over and over again, and something else, and something that sounded like "break the circle, break the circle." Thomas thought about the journal entries, about boys from different times, all the same age. What if the lake didn't just trap the 4 boys from 1911? What if it had been claiming boys for much longer, creating some kind of supernatural cycle? "Billy, I need you to do something for me," Thomas said. "I need you to watch the lake tonight and tell me if you see anything unusual. But don't go near the water, and don't tell any of the other counselors what you're doing. Can you do that?" Billy nodded eagerly, happy to have an adult who believed him. That evening, Thomas waited until the camp settled into its nightly routine before making his way back to the archives. If the lake had been claiming boys for longer than 1911, there might be other records, other disappearances that had been forgotten or explained away. He spent hours going through boxes of old documents, and what he found chilled him to the bone. Every 14 years, like clockwork, there were reports of boys disappearing at Camp Wildwood. 1883, 4 boys, ages 14, vanished during a night swim. Bodies never recovered. 1897, 4 boys, ages 14, took a canoe out after lights out and were never seen again. 1911, the boys he already knew about, and if the pattern held true, the next disappearance should have been in 1925, this summer. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized the horrible truth. The 4 boys hadn't been visiting Camp Wildwood as normal campers. They were supernatural entities, trapped in a 14-year cycle, appearing at the camp to lure new victims into the lake's depths. Every 14 years, 4 new boys would be chosen to replace them, and the cycle would continue. But something had gone wrong this summer. Instead of claiming new victims, the ghostly boys had become visible to Thomas and Billy. Instead of successfully completing their supernatural mission, they were asking for help. A scream from outside shattered the night silence. Thomas ran from the archives toward the sound and found Billy Peterson standing at the edge of the lake, pointing at the water with a trembling hand. "Mr. Mitchell," Billy cried, "they're not alone anymore, look!" Thomas followed Billy's gaze and felt his heart nearly stop. In the moonlit water, he could see not just 4 figures, but dozens of them. Boys of all different eras, dressed in the camp uniforms of their respective times, all standing waist-deep in the lake. Some wore the simple shorts and shirts of the 1880s, others the more elaborate uniforms of the early 1900s. All of them were 14 years old. All of them were staring at the shore with pleading expressions, and all of them were mouthing the same desperate words: "Help us, break the circle." The next day, Thomas knew he needed help understanding what he was facing. He remembered the journal's mention of Mr. Clearwater, the Mohawk guide who had warned the boys about the lake in 1911. If the man was still alive, he might be the only person who could explain the supernatural forces at work. Thomas drove his Model T Ford into the nearby town of Millbrook Falls, a small community that had grown up around the lumber industry in the late 1800s. The main street was lined with weathered storefronts and wooden sidewalks, and the locals regarded him with the polite suspicion reserved for outsiders. At the general store, he inquired about Mr. Clearwater and was directed to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. The elderly Mohawk man who answered the door looked to be in his 70s, his long grey hair braided with beads, and his weathered face marked by deep lines that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. "You're from the camp," Joseph Clearwater said before Thomas could introduce himself. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. I'm Thomas Mitchell, one of the counselors. I was hoping you might help me understand something about the lake." Clearwater studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him enter. The cabin was sparse but comfortable, decorated with traditional Mohawk crafts and filled with the scent of sage and tobacco. "So you've seen them," Clearwater said as he poured 2 cups of strong coffee. "The boys in the water." Thomas nearly dropped his cup. "You know about them?" "My people have known about that cursed water for generations. We tried to warn the white settlers when they first built their camp, but they wouldn't listen. They never do." Clearwater settled into a worn leather chair, his dark eyes fixed on Thomas. "How many did you see?" "Dozens. All about 14 years old, all wearing different uniforms from different time periods." Clearwater nodded grimly. "The circle grows stronger with each cycle. Soon it will be too powerful to break." "What circle? What's causing this?" The old man was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if he'd decided not to answer. Finally, Clearwater spoke, his voice heavy with old sorrow. "Long ago, before the white man came to this land, there was a village by that lake. It was a sacred place, where our young warriors would undergo trials to prove their worthiness. The spirits of the water would test them, and those who passed would return as men." Clearwater stood and walked to a window that looked out toward the distant forest where Camp Wildwood lay hidden. But one year something went wrong. A group of young warriors, proud and foolish, attempted to cheat the spirit's test. They used dark magic, forbidden rituals, trying to gain power without proving their worth. The spirits became angry, and in their rage they cursed the lake. What kind of curse? The warriors were trapped forever, at the age they had been when they tried to cheat death, 14 summers old, the age of testing. The spirits decreed that they would remain in the water until they could find others to take their place, but the replacement must be willing, must choose to join them of their own free will. Thomas felt sick as the implications became clear. So every 14 years they tried to lure new boys into the lake. Yes, and for generations they succeeded. The white man's children proved easier to tempt than our own. Your people build their camps and bring their young to the very place where the hungry spirits wait. But this summer was different. The 4 boys from 1911, they didn't try to lure anyone new. Instead, they seemed to be asking for help. Clearwater turned from the window, his expression surprised. That should not be possible. The curse compels them to seek replacements. It is not a choice they can make. Maybe something changed. Maybe after all these years, they found a way to resist. Or maybe, Clearwater said slowly, the curse is finally weakening. There are old stories, prophecies about how such curses can be broken, but the cost is always high. Tell me. Clearwater returned to his chair and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a collection of carved bone pieces, covered in symbols Thomas didn't recognize. The curse can only be broken by one who sees truth where others see lies, who remembers what others forget, someone who chooses to act without being compelled by the spirit's magic. He looked directly at Thomas. Someone like you. What would I have to do? The original warriors used a sacred stone to anchor their dark magic. It lies at the bottom of the lake, in the deepest part where the spirits gather. If that stone could be retrieved and destroyed, the curse would be broken. All the trapped souls would be freed. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. I'd have to dive to the bottom of the lake, in the deep water. Where the spirits are strongest, they will try to stop you, try to add you to their number, and if you fail... Clearwater didn't need to finish the sentence. What about Billy Peterson? He can see them too. The young one has the gift of true sight, but he lacks the strength to resist the spirit's pull. That is why they chose to reveal themselves to him, hoping to claim him as they have claimed so many others. Thomas thought about Billy's innocent face, his trust and eagerness to help. The idea of that 10-year-old boy being dragged into the cursed waters made his decision easier. If I try this and succeed, what happens to all the boys who are already trapped? They will finally be free to move on to the spirit world where they belong. Their long suffering will end. And if I fail... Clearwater's weathered face was grave. Then the curse grows stronger, and the lake will claim not just you, but many more in the years to come. The circle of suffering will continue, perhaps forever. Thomas stood up, his mind made up despite the terror coursing through his veins. Then I guess I'd better not fail. As he prepared to leave, Clearwater handed him a small carved stone pendant. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It may offer some protection against the spirit's magic, but do not rely on it too heavily. In the end, your own will and courage will be your strongest weapons." Thomas drove back to Camp Wildwood as the sun began to set, the weight of his mission pressing down on him like a physical burden. Tonight, he would attempt something that could save dozens of trapped souls or damn himself to an eternity of supernatural servitude. Either way, the long nightmare of Lake Wildwood was about to come to an end. Thomas waited until well past midnight before making his move. The camp lay silent under a moonless sky, with only the distant sound of night insects breaking the oppressive quiet. He had spent the evening preparing, gathering rope, a waterproof lantern, and the diving equipment the camp kept for emergency rescues. Most importantly, he wore Clearwater's protective pendant beneath his shirt, its carved surface warm against his skin. Billy Peterson appeared at the edge of the woods as Thomas made his way to the lake, moving like a small ghost in his white pajamas. "You're going into the water, aren't you?" the 10-year-old whispered. "Billy, you should be in bed. This is dangerous." "I know, but they told me you were coming." Billy pointed toward the lake, where dozens of spectral figures now stood in the shallows, their forms more solid and visible than ever before. "They're waiting for you." Thomas knelt beside the boy. "Billy, no matter what happens tonight, I need you to promise me something. If I don't come back up, you have to tell the other counselors what you've seen. Make them believe you. Don't let them forget about the boys in the lake." Billy nodded solemnly. "I promise, Mr. Mitchell. But you are coming back up, right?" "I hope so." As Thomas approached the water's edge, the ghostly boys parted to create a clear path toward the lake's center. He could see their faces clearly now, not just David, Marcus, Samuel, and Jonathan from 1911, but boys from every era since the curse began. Some wore the simple camp clothes of the 1880s, others the more elaborate uniforms of different decades. All of them were 14 years old, all of them trapped in the moment of their greatest youth and promise. David Brennan stepped forward from the group, his serious eyes filled with desperate hope. "Thomas," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the water despite the impossibility of it. "You can see us, you can remember us. That makes you our only chance." "I know about the stone," Thomas replied. "I know what I have to do. The spirits will try to stop you," Marcus O'Sullivan warned, his gap-toothed smile replaced by worry. "They'll show you things, terrible things. They'll try to make you join us willingly." Samuel Pierce nodded, his freckled face pale with concern. "The deeper you go, the stronger their influence becomes. Don't listen to their promises. Don't believe their lies. And whatever you do," Jonathan Hayes added, his athletic frame tense with urgency, "don't let them convince you that joining us would be easier than fighting. We've been trapped here for 14 years, watching new boys arrive every cycle, unable to warn them or protect them. It's not peace, it's endless suffering." Thomas waded into the water, feeling its unnatural coldness seep through his clothing. The temperature should have been refreshing on such a warm summer night, but instead it felt like ice water flowing through his veins. As he moved deeper, the ghostly boys followed, forming a protective circle around him. "How deep is the stone?" Thomas asked. 60 feet, David replied. "At the very bottom, in a cave beneath the old foundation Jonathan found. The spirits guard it constantly." Thomas had been a strong swimmer in college, but 60 feet was beyond his normal diving capability. He would need to push his body to its absolute limits, and even then, he might not have enough air to retrieve the stone and make it back to the surface. As the water reached his chest, Thomas felt the first touch of the spirit's influence. Whispers began at the edge of his hearing, soft voices speaking words he couldn't quite understand. The pendant around his neck grew warmer, as if responding to some unseen threat. "We're with you," Samuel said. "We can't fight the spirits directly, but we can guide you to the stone." Thomas took a deep breath and dove. The water beneath the surface was black as ink, and his waterproof lantern provided only a small circle of yellowish light. As he descended, the pressure built in his ears and lungs, but he forced himself to continue downward. 20 feet, 30 feet. The whispers grew louder, and he began to see shapes moving in the darkness beyond his light. At 40 feet, the spirits made their first direct assault on his mind. Suddenly, Thomas wasn't in the lake anymore. He was standing in his childhood home, warm and dry, with his mother calling him for dinner. The vision was so vivid, so achingly real, that he almost forgot where he was. His lungs demanded air, but the vision told him he didn't need it, that he was safe and sound in his family's kitchen. The pendant's heat against his chest snapped him back to reality. He was underwater, running out of air, and the spirits were trying to kill him with false comfort. Thomas kicked harder, pushing deeper into the lake's depths. 50 feet. The pressure was enormous now, and bright spots danced at the edges of his vision. The spirit's whispers had become a roar, promising him everything he'd ever wanted if he would just stop fighting and let the water fill his lungs. At 60 feet, his lantern illuminated the ghostly outline of a stone foundation, the remains of some ancient structure that had stood here long before the camp was built. And there, in the center of what might once have been a ceremonial circle, lay a stone unlike any Thomas had ever seen. It was perfectly black, absorbing his lantern's light rather than reflecting it, and covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked directly at them. The cursed stone that had anchored the dark magic for over a century. As Thomas reached for it, the water around him exploded into chaos. The spirits materialized in their true forms, not the innocent boys they appeared to be on the surface, but twisted, angry entities with eyes like burning coals and mouths opened in eternal screams. They clawed at him, trying to drag him away from the stone, their touch like ice that burned. But the ghostly boys from the camp were there too, fighting alongside him. David grabbed one spirit and wrestled it away from Thomas. Marcus and Samuel formed a barrier between him and the worst of the supernatural assault. Jonathan used his athletic strength to clear a path to the stone. Thomas's lungs were screaming for air, and black spots were closing in on his vision. He had seconds before he would lose consciousness. With the last of his strength, he grasped the cursed stone and kicked off from the lake bottom, racing toward the surface as the spirit's fury reached a crescendo around him. The stone was impossibly heavy, as if it wanted to drag him back down to the depths, but Thomas held on, using every ounce of will and determination to fight his way upward through the black water and the grasping hands of ancient evil. 60 feet had never seemed so far. Thomas's lungs burned like fire as he fought his way toward the surface. The cursed stone clutched against his chest like a lead weight, trying to drag him back into the depths. The water around him churned with supernatural fury as the ancient spirits launched their final assault, desperate to prevent him from escaping with their source of power. Ghostly hands clawed at his legs and arms, their touch so cold it felt like burning. The spirit's screams filled the water with a sound like breaking glass, and Thomas felt his eardrums threatening to burst from the pressure. But the 4 boys from 1911 stayed with him, forming a protective barrier as they all ascended together. "Don't let go of the stone," David shouted, his voice somehow audible even underwater. "No matter what they show you, don't let go." The spirits, realizing their physical attacks were failing, shifted to psychological warfare. The water around Thomas suddenly cleared, and he found himself swimming upward through what appeared to be his college swimming pool. His teammates were cheering from the sidelines, and his coach was timing his laps with a stopwatch. The stone in his hands had become his lucky medal, the one he'd worn during championships. "Just a few more strokes, Tommy," his old coach called. "You're going to break the record." For a moment, Thomas almost believed it. The vision was so perfect, so detailed, that it felt more real than the supernatural nightmare he'd been living. But then he noticed that everyone in the vision was 14 years old. His coach, his teammates, even himself, as he glimpsed his reflection in the pool's surface. The spirits were trying to trap him in their eternal adolescence, making him forget his true purpose. The pendant burned against his chest, and Thomas remembered where he was and what he was fighting for. He kicked harder, breaking through the illusion like shattering glass. 40 feet from the surface, 30 feet. His vision was going black around the edges, and his chest felt like it might explode. The stone seemed to grow heavier with each foot he climbed, as if the curse itself was fighting to remain in the depths. "We can carry it," Samuel offered, reaching for the stone. "No," Thomas gasped, somehow speaking even underwater. Clearwater said, "I have to be the one. Someone not compelled by the spirit's magic." 20 feet. The water above him began to lighten slightly, showing the faint suggestion of moonlight filtering down from the surface. But the spirits made one last desperate attempt to stop him. The water around Thomas suddenly became thick as molasses, making every movement an enormous effort. The stone began to vibrate in his hands, its carved symbols glowing with an evil red light that cut through the darkness like fire. And all around him the spirits began to speak in unison, their voices combining into a sound that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his mind. "Join us willingly," they said, "and we will give you everything you've ever wanted. Youth eternal. Freedom from responsibility. No more loss, no more pain, no more growing old and dying alone. For a terrifying moment, Thomas felt the appeal of their offer. He thought about his uncertain future, his fear of failure, his loneliness since coming to work at the isolated camp. What would it be like to remain 14 forever, surrounded by friends who would never leave him, never change, never disappoint him? Don't listen, Jonathan warned. That's not life, that's a beautiful prison. We thought we wanted it too, Marcus added. But we've been 14 for 14 years, and we're still 14 inside our heads. We can't grow, can't change, can't become who we were meant to be. It's not immortality, it's a living death. Their words cut through the spirit's seductive promises, and Thomas found the strength for a final push toward the surface. 10 feet. 5 feet. His lungs were completely empty now, and he could feel consciousness slipping away. Then his head broke through the surface of Lake Wildwood, and he gasped in a lungful of sweet night air. Billy Peterson was waiting at the shore, jumping up and down with excitement and relief. "You did it! You got it!" But Thomas wasn't safe yet. The stone in his hands was still pulsing with malevolent energy, and he could feel the lake itself trying to drag him back down. The ghostly boys appeared around him in the water, more solid and visible than ever before. "You have to destroy it now," David urged, "before the spirits recover their strength." "How?" Thomas gasped, treading water while holding the impossibly heavy stone. "Clear water gave you everything you need," Samuel said, pointing to the pendant around Thomas's neck. "The old magic can break the new." Thomas looked down at the carved pendant, understanding flooding through him. The symbols on Clearwater's ancestral stone were the opposite of those on the cursed rock. Where the curse bound and trapped, the pendant was meant to free and release. With his last reserves of strength, Thomas pressed the pendant against the cursed stone. The reaction was immediate and violent. Both stones began to glow, the cursed one with angry red light, the pendant with soft white radiance. The water around Thomas began to churn and bubble as if it were boiling, and a sound like thunder rolled across the lake. "It's working!" Billy shouted from the shore. The cursed stone grew so hot that Thomas could barely hold it, but he forced himself to keep the pendant pressed against its surface. Cracks appeared in the black rock, spreading like spider webs across its surface. The carved symbols writhed and twisted, as if trying to escape, and the spirit's screams reached a crescendo that shattered windows in the distant camp buildings. With a sound like the world breaking apart, the cursed stone split in half. The effect was instantaneous. A shockwave of pure white light exploded from the broken stone, washing over the entire lake and surrounding forest. The water became perfectly still, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Camp Wildwood for decades suddenly lifted. Around Thomas, the ghostly boys began to change. Their forms became brighter, more translucent, and their faces filled with peace and gratitude. "Thank you," David said, his voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Thank you for giving us back our freedom." One by one, the trapped souls began to fade away, finally able to move on to whatever came after this world. Thomas watched as boys from dozens of different eras smiled and waved goodbye, their long nightmare finally at an end. The 4 boys from 1911 were the last to go. "Will I remember you?" Thomas asked. "I think so," David replied. "You're the one who saved us. That kind of memory doesn't fade." And then they were gone, leaving Thomas alone in the suddenly peaceful water of Lake Wildwood, holding the broken pieces of a curse that had lasted for over a century. Thomas awoke in the camp infirmary, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Sunlight streamed through the white curtains, and he could hear the normal sounds of camp life outside. Boys laughing, counselors calling instructions, the distant splash of swimmers in the lake. Everything seemed impossibly bright and cheerful after the supernatural darkness he'd experienced. Helen Cartwright sat in a chair beside his bed, her nurse's cap slightly askew and dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been there all night. "You gave us quite a scare, young man," she said, setting down her knitting as he stirred. "Billy Peterson found you floating unconscious in the lake around 3 in the morning. What on earth were you thinking, swimming alone in the dark?" Thomas tried to sit up, his head spinning slightly. "Billy found me? Is he okay?" "He's fine, though he was nearly hysterical when he woke me up, kept talking about spirits and cursed stones and boys from 1911. Poor child has quite an imagination." Helen felt his forehead with a practiced hand. "No fever, but you were hypothermic when we pulled you out. You're lucky to be alive." As Helen spoke, fragments of memory began returning to Thomas. The dive into the black depths, the cursed stone, the ghostly boys who had guided him to safety, but as he tried to focus on the details, they seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. "Helen," Thomas said carefully, "has anything strange ever happened at this lake? Any stories about boys disappearing or supernatural occurrences?" The nurse laughed, but it sounded forced. "Goodness, you sound as imaginative as young Billy. It's just a lake, Thomas. A perfectly normal, if unusually deep mountain lake." But Thomas noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, as if she too had vague memories of things that didn't quite make sense. Billy Peterson appeared in the infirmary doorway, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mr. Mitchell, you're awake. I was so worried when I found you floating there. Billy, what exactly did you see last night?" The 10-year-old glanced at Helen, then back at Thomas. "I saw you swimming toward the middle of the lake. You were underwater for so long I thought you'd drowned. Then suddenly you came up and you were holding something that glowed really bright. After the light faded, you just floated there like you were sleeping. What happened to what I was holding?" "It crumbled apart and sank back down, like it was made of sand or something." Helen frowned. "Billy, I've told you Mr. Mitchell wasn't holding anything when we found him. You were half asleep and confused." But Thomas could see the truth in Billy's eyes. The boy remembered everything, just as Clearwater had said he would. Some people had the gift of true sight, the ability to see past supernatural veils and remember what others forgot. "I need to get up," Thomas said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Absolutely not," Helen protested. "You need at least another day of rest. Near drowning is nothing to take lightly." "I feel fine, better than fine, actually." And it was true. Despite the ordeal he'd been through, Thomas felt more energetic and clear-headed than he had in weeks. It was as if some oppressive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Director Harrison appeared in the doorway, his usually stern face creased with concern. "Mitchell, glad to see you're awake. What the devil were you thinking, swimming alone at night? You could have been killed." "I'm sorry, sir, it won't happen again." Harrison studied him for a moment. "See that it doesn't. We can't afford to lose counselors to foolish accidents." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Strange thing, though. Some of the boys have been asking about campers they swear they remember from earlier in the summer. 4 boys, they say, from Cabin 7. But our records show Cabin 7 has been closed all season." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "What did you tell them?" "That they must be confused, of course. Memory can play tricks, especially with all the excitement of camp life. Still, it's odd that so many of them have the same false memory." After Harrison left, Thomas managed to convince Helen to let him return to his cabin for rest. But instead of sleeping, he made his way to the lakeshore, drawn by a need to see the water in daylight. Lake Wildwood looked completely different now. The water was a clear, brilliant blue instead of the ominous black it had appeared before. Fish jumped freely near the surface, and dragonflies danced above the reeds. Even the air smelled different, fresh and clean instead of heavy with unexpressed dread. Billy Peterson joined him at the water's edge, carrying a small wooden boat he'd been working on in craft time. "It's different now, isn't it?" the boy said quietly. "The lake doesn't feel scary anymore." "No, it doesn't." "Do you think they're happy now? The boys who were trapped?" Thomas thought about David's peaceful expression as he faded away, about the gratitude in the eyes of all those lost souls finally finding freedom. "Yes, Billy, I think they're very happy." Billy launched his small boat onto the calm water, and they watched it sail serenely toward the center of the lake. As it moved, Thomas could swear he heard something on the breeze, not the desperate whispers he'd grown accustomed to, but something else. Laughter. The sound of boys playing, but distant and joyful, as if carried from somewhere far beyond this world. "Did you hear that?" Billy asked. "I think I did. It sounds like they're finally free to play again." Thomas nodded, understanding that Billy's innocent wisdom had captured something profound. The boys weren't gone. They had simply moved on to wherever 14-year-olds were meant to go when their earthly time was finished. A place where they could grow and change and become the men they were always meant to be. As the afternoon wore on, more campers joined them at the lake shore. For the first time all summer, the entire camp seemed drawn to the water not by supernatural compulsion, but by simple joy. Boys splashed and swam and laughed, their voices carrying across the water in perfect harmony with the natural sounds of the forest. Camp Wildwood had finally become what it was always supposed to be, a place where children could be children, where memories were made that would last a lifetime, and where the only spirits that lingered were those of friendship and adventure. Thomas smiled as he watched Billy's boat disappear around a bend in the shoreline, carrying with it the last echoes of an ancient curse that would never again darken the waters of Lake Wildwood. 3 days after the breaking of the curse, Thomas was leading a nature hike when he spotted an unfamiliar automobile making its way up the camp's dusty access road. The black Ford Model A looked official, and Thomas felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Had someone reported the strange events at the lake? Were there questions about his midnight swim that he wouldn't be able to answer? Director Harrison met the visitors at the main lodge, 2 men in dark suits who looked distinctly out of place in the rustic camp setting. Thomas watched from a distance as they spoke with Harrison, noting the director's increasingly puzzled expressions and frequent glances toward the lake. After the men left, Harrison called Thomas to his office. The director's usually composed demeanor seemed shaken, and he poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, despite the early hour. "Those were investigators from the State Historical Society," Harrison said without preamble. "They came here asking about records from 1911, specifically about 4 boys who supposedly drowned that summer." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. What did they want to know? They claim they've been researching a pattern of disappearances at various camps and schools throughout the region, always involving groups of 4 boys, always around the age of 14. They said the pattern goes back over a century. Harrison took a long sip of his whiskey. "The strange thing is I found records of exactly what they described, boys who drowned in 1911, just as they said. But I could have sworn those files didn't exist yesterday. Maybe they were misfiled. Perhaps, but here's the truly peculiar part. They also had records from other camps, other lakes. The same pattern every 14 years, dating back to the 1880s. And according to their research, it all stopped 3 days ago." Thomas tried to keep his expression neutral. Stopped. No new disappearances reported anywhere in the region since Tuesday night. After decades of this pattern, it just ended. Harrison studied Thomas carefully. "They seemed very interested in talking to you specifically. Said they'd heard you'd had some kind of swimming accident that same night. What did you tell them? That you were recovering and not available for interviews. But Thomas, if there's anything you need to tell me about what happened that night..." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion outside the office window caught their attention. Billy Peterson was running across the campgrounds, his face flushed with excitement, pointing toward the lake. "Mr. Harrison, Mr. Mitchell, come quick. There are people at the lake who want to talk to you." Thomas and Harrison hurried outside to find a small group of elderly people gathered at the water's edge. They appeared to be in their 70s and 80s, well dressed despite the rustic setting, and all of them were staring at the lake with expressions of wonder and disbelief. "Can we help you folks?" Harrison asked politely. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes stepped forward. "My name is Catherine O'Sullivan Morrison. My maiden name was O'Sullivan. I'm here because of my older brother, Marcus." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. Marcus O'Sullivan, the gap-toothed boy from 1911. "Marcus came to this camp every summer from 1909 to 1911, the woman continued. "He was my parents' pride and joy, always making everyone laugh with his jokes and stories. He drowned here in the summer of 1911, along with 3 other boys." Another elderly person, a distinguished man with a walking cane, stepped forward. "I'm Charles Brennan. David Brennan was my older brother. He was supposed to start at Harvard in the fall of 1911, but he never made it home from camp." A thin woman with gentle features joined them. "Sarah Pierce Whitman. Samuel Pierce was my twin brother. We were both supposed to turn 15 that September." Finally, a robust man, despite his age, spoke up. "Robert Hayes. Jonathan was my cousin, the best athlete our family ever produced. We always wondered what might have become of him." Harrison looked bewildered. "I'm sorry for your losses, but I'm not sure why you've all come here today. That tragedy happened 14 years ago." "Because 3 nights ago," Catherine Morrison said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I had the most vivid dream of my life. I saw Marcus standing in this lake, but he looked exactly as he did when he was 14. He told me he was finally free, finally able to move on. He said someone had helped him, someone brave enough to dive into the darkness." Charles Brennan nodded. "David came to me in a dream too. He thanked me for never forgetting him and said he was ready to become the man he was meant to be." Sarah Whitman wiped tears from her eyes. "Samuel told me he could finally put down his journal and stop trying to record everything, because his story had finally reached its proper ending." Robert Hayes looked directly at Thomas. "Jonathan said someone at this camp had given them all a second chance at eternity, someone who chose courage over safety." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the emotion in their faces, the gratitude and peace that seemed to radiate from this group of elderly siblings and relatives. "We don't know how or why," Catherine Morrison continued, "but we all woke up from those dreams knowing, absolutely knowing, that our boys were finally at rest. For the first time in 14 years, we felt peace." Billy Peterson tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Tell them," he whispered urgently. "Tell them what you did." But before Thomas could speak, Harrison stepped forward with sudden understanding. "You're the families who buried the time capsule in 1925, he said slowly. "I found a record of it yesterday. You came here on the 14th anniversary of their deaths to honor their memory." "We did," Charles Brennan confirmed. "It was supposed to be opened this year, as a remembrance. But somehow, it seems our boys found a way to open it themselves." Thomas thought about the time capsule he'd discovered in the archives, about Samuel's journal and the photograph that had started this entire supernatural adventure. The families had never intended to create a mystical connection to their lost children, but love had a power all its own. "We just wanted to thank whoever was responsible," Sarah Whitman said. "We don't need to understand how it happened. We just know that it did, and our families can finally heal." As the elderly visitors prepared to leave, Catherine Morrison approached Thomas privately. "You have kind eyes," she said. "Marcus always trusted people with kind eyes. If you had anything to do with helping our boys find peace, then you have the eternal gratitude of 4 families who have been grieving for far too long." After the families departed, Thomas stood alone at the lake's edge as the sun began to set. The water was perfectly calm, reflecting the orange and pink sky like a mirror. For the first time since arriving at Camp Wildwood, he felt completely at peace. Billy Peterson joined him, skipping stones across the water's surface. "They knew, didn't they?" the boy asked. "They knew you saved their brothers." "I think love has its own kind of magic," Thomas replied. "Sometimes it's stronger than any curse." As the last stone disappeared beneath the surface, Thomas could have sworn he heard it again. Distant laughter carried on the evening breeze, but this time it sounded like people of all ages, reunited at last in whatever realm lay beyond this world. As the final week of camp approached, Thomas began to notice changes that went far beyond the lifting of the supernatural curse. The transformation of Lake Wildwood seemed to be spreading outward like ripples in a pond, affecting not just the camp, but the entire surrounding community. The first sign came when Joseph Clearwater visited unexpectedly, driving up in an old pickup truck just as the boys were finishing their morning swim. The elderly Mohawk man looked years younger than when Thomas had seen him just a week earlier, his weathered face bright with something that could only be described as relief. "The land is healing," Clearwater said without preamble as he and Thomas walked along the shoreline. "My people have felt it. The spirits that were trapped in anger and sorrow have finally found peace. The balance has been restored." "I can feel it too," Thomas admitted. "Everything seems lighter somehow, more alive." Clearwater nodded, bending to pick up a smooth stone from the beach. "When one curse is broken, it weakens others. There were other dark places in this region, other wounds in the spirit world, that have been festering for generations. Your courage has begun to heal them all." As if to prove his point, a family of deer emerged from the forest and approached the water's edge, showing no fear of the humans nearby. Thomas had never seen wildlife so close to the camp before, as if the animals had previously sensed something wrong with this place. "The State Historical Society investigators came back yesterday," Thomas told Clearwater. "They said similar patterns of disappearances have stopped at other locations throughout New York and New England. All on the same night, I broke the stone." "Curses are like a disease," Clearwater explained. "So they spread from one sacred place to another, corrupting the natural order. When you destroyed the source, you began a cleansing that will continue for years to come." That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 20s arrived at camp in a Model T Ford, asking to speak with Thomas specifically. She introduced herself as Margaret Sinclair, a reporter for the Albany Times-Union. "I'm investigating what locals are calling the Great Peace," she explained as they sat on the lodge's front porch. "Starting about a week ago, there have been reports throughout the region of people feeling suddenly liberated from old traumas and unexplained fears, families reconciling after generations of feuds, children sleeping peacefully after years of nightmares. Even the crime rate in several counties has dropped dramatically." Thomas tried to look interested but not overly knowledgeable. "That sounds like coincidence to me." "Perhaps. But the epicenter of all these reports seems to be this lake, and I've spoken to several families who claim their relatives who died in accidents here over the years have appeared to them in dreams telling them they've found peace. Margaret pulled out a notebook filled with careful handwriting. The Morrison family in Boston, the Brennans in Cambridge, the Pierce family in Albany, the Hayes clan in Buffalo, all reporting similar experiences on the same night, all involving relatives who died at this camp in 1911. Thomas felt his mouth go dry, but Margaret continued before he could respond. I've also spoken to families whose children disappeared at other camps and schools throughout the region. The Whitmore boys who vanished at Camp Mohican in 1897, the Sullivan brothers who drowned at Lake George in 1883, the Patterson twins who disappeared at Saratoga Springs in 1869, all reporting the same phenomenon, dreams of reconciliation and peace. What do you think it means? Margaret studied his face carefully. I think something extraordinary happened here last week, something that gave rest to souls who had been trapped for decades. I think someone performed an act of incredible courage that broke a cycle of suffering that had been going on for generations. Before Thomas could respond, Billy Peterson came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. Mr. Mitchell, you have to come see this. Something amazing is happening at the lake. Thomas and Margaret followed Billy to the water's edge, where they found the entire camp gathered in amazed silence. The lake's surface was covered with what appeared to be flowers, thousands of white water lilies that had seemingly appeared from nowhere. They just started blooming all at once, one of the older campers explained. Like someone flipped a switch, the whole lake is covered. Helen Cartwright stood at the water's edge, tears streaming down her face. I've never seen anything like it. Water lilies don't even grow in this lake. The water's too deep, too cold. But there they were, pristine white blossoms floating serenely across the entire surface of Lake Wildwood, filling the air with a sweet fragrance that seemed to wash away the last traces of any darkness that had ever touched this place. In my people's tradition, Clearwater said quietly, having appeared beside them as silently as a shadow, white lilies are the flowers of the afterlife. They bloom when spirits find their way home. Margaret scribbled furiously in her notebook. This is impossible. Flowers don't just appear like this. There has to be a scientific explanation. Some things can't be explained by science, Billy said, with the wisdom of a child who had seen wonders. Sometimes magic is just magic. As the afternoon wore on, visitors began arriving from town. Word of the miraculous blooming had spread quickly, and people came from miles around to witness the phenomenon. Families brought their children. Elderly couples held hands as they watched the flowers dance on the gentle breeze, and everyone who saw the lake seemed to leave with a sense of peace they hadn't possessed when they arrived. That evening, as the white lilies glowed ethereally in the moonlight, Thomas sat alone on the dock, finally allowing himself to fully process what he had accomplished. Not just the breaking of one curse, but the beginning of a healing that would spread throughout the region for years to come. The sound of footsteps on the wooden dock announced Billy's arrival. The 10-year-old sat beside Thomas, dangling his feet in the cool water. Do you think they'll remember us? Billy asked. David and Marcus and Samuel and Jonathan? Thomas considered the question carefully. I think they'll remember that someone cared enough to help them, but I also think they're too busy becoming who they were always meant to be to spend much time looking backward. Billy nodded solemnly. That's good. Everyone deserves a chance to grow up. As they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the gentle fragrance of impossible flowers and the soft sounds of a lake finally at peace, Thomas realized that he too had been transformed by his experience. The young man who had arrived at Camp Wildwood just a month ago had been uncertain, searching for direction in his life. Now he felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Some people were meant to teach, others to heal, still others to create beautiful things. But Thomas had discovered he was meant to be a guardian, someone who stood between the innocent and the darkness, someone who chose courage when others chose safety. It was a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life, and as the white lilies danced on the moonlit water, he welcomed it with an open heart. On the last night of camp, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. The weight of keeping such an extraordinary secret was beginning to take its toll, and he felt compelled to create some record of what had truly happened at Lake Wildwood. Future generations deserved to know the truth, even if they chose not to believe it. He made his way to the camp office and began to write by lamplight, documenting everything from his discovery of the 1911 photograph to the breaking of the cursed stone. As he wrote, he realized he was following in Samuel Pierce's footsteps, keeping a detailed journal of events that seemed too incredible to be real. A soft knock at the office door interrupted his writing. Billy Peterson stood in the doorway, wearing his pajamas and carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I couldn't sleep either, Billy said. I kept thinking about them, about how they tried so hard to leave messages for people to find. What's in the bundle, Billy? The 10-year-old unwrapped the cloth to reveal several items, a wooden whistle, some old coins, and most importantly, a small leather journal. Thomas recognized them immediately as the contents of the 1911 time capsule. I went back to the archives and found these, Billy explained. I think Samuel would want someone to continue his story, to write down the ending he never got to finish. Thomas accepted the journal with reverence, opening it to the final entry he'd read a week earlier. Samuel's handwriting was neat and careful, even in his final moments of writing. You're right, Billy. Someone should finish their story. Using Samuel's own pen, which had been preserved in the time capsule, Thomas began to write on the page, immediately following the boy's last entry. August 15th, 1925. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I am writing this 14 years after Samuel Pierce wrote his final entry. I want Samuel to know that his journal was found, that his story was read, and that he and his friends were remembered with love and courage. Tonight, I helped them find their way home. As Thomas wrote, he felt a strange sensation as if someone was guiding his hand. The words flowed easily, telling the story of the curses breaking from the perspective of someone who understood both the supernatural terror and the profound love that had ultimately triumphed. Billy watched with fascination as Thomas filled page after page. It feels like they're still here, doesn't it? Just for tonight, helping you tell their story. Thomas paused in his writing, suddenly aware that the office had grown warmer despite the cool night air. The shadows in the corners seemed softer, more welcoming, and he could swear he heard the faint sound of breathing that wasn't his or Billy's. David? Thomas called softly into the apparent emptiness. Marcus? Samuel? Jonathan? Are you here? For a moment, nothing happened. Then, incredibly, Samuel's journal began to write itself. Words appeared on the page in the same careful handwriting Thomas had been reading, but the pen wasn't moving in his hand. Instead, it hovered just above the paper as invisible fingers guided it. We are here, Thomas, one last time to say goodbye properly and to thank you for giving us back our freedom. We wanted you to know that your courage didn't just save us, it saved countless others who were trapped in similar darkness. The pen paused, then continued in a different handwriting style that Thomas recognized as David's. We also wanted to tell you that your life has purpose beyond what you can imagine. You have a gift for seeing truth where others see lies, for remembering what others forget. Use it wisely. Marcus's distinctive scrawl appeared next. And don't take everything so seriously. Life is meant to be enjoyed, even when you're fighting monsters. Especially when you're fighting monsters. Finally, Jonathan's bold handwriting filled the remaining space. Be strong, be brave, but most importantly, be kind. The world needs more people who choose to help rather than harm. As the final word was written, the pen fell still in Thomas's hand. The office grew cooler, and the sense of presence faded gradually like a gentle goodbye. Billy wiped tears from his eyes. They really are gone now, aren't they? Yes, Thomas said, closing the journal carefully. But they went exactly as they should have, peacefully, with love, and knowing they were remembered. Thomas spent the rest of the night writing his own account of the events, creating a complete record that he sealed in a new time capsule along with Samuel's journal. He buried it beneath the oak tree where the original capsule had been found, but this time he included instructions that it should be opened not in 14 years, but only if supernatural events ever threatened Camp Wildwood. Again, as dawn broke over the lake, still covered in its miraculous carpet of white lilies, the campers began their preparations to leave. Thomas watched them pack their belongings and exchange addresses, promising to write letters and visit each other during the school year. It was the same ritual that had played out at the end of every summer for decades, but now it carried no underlying sense of dread. Billy Peterson was among the last to leave, his parents arriving in a dusty Ford to collect their son. As he said goodbye to Thomas, the boy pressed something into his hand, a small, carefully carved wooden figure. I made it in craft time, Billy explained. It's you diving into the lake, so you'll always remember that you're a hero even when it doesn't feel like it. Thomas looked down at the little figure, surprisingly detailed for the work of a 10-year-old. It showed a man diving downward, one hand extended as if reaching for something in the depths. Thank you, Billy. This means more to me than you know. Will I see you next summer? Billy asked. Thomas looked out at the peaceful lake, at the camp that had become a place of healing rather than horror. I think I'll be here for many summers to come. Someone needs to watch over this place, make sure it stays peaceful. As Billy's family drove away, Thomas realized he had found his calling. He would become the permanent caretaker of Camp Wildwood, its guardian against any darkness that might threaten its tranquility. He would watch over future generations of children, ensuring they experienced only the joy and growth that summer camps were meant to provide. Director Harrison approached as Thomas stood watching the last of the families depart. "I've been thinking," Harrison said. "How would you like to stay on year-round as our facilities manager? Someone with your dedication to this place would be invaluable in preparing for future seasons." Thomas smiled, feeling as if the universe was confirming his decision. "I'd like that very much, sir." As the day progressed and the last of the summer's residents departed, Thomas found himself alone with the transformed lake. The white lilies were beginning to fade now, their purpose fulfilled, but they left behind water that was clearer and more beautiful than anyone at the camp had ever seen. That evening, as Thomas sat on the dock for what he knew would be the first of many solitary vigils, he felt a profound sense of completion. The supernatural nightmare that had plagued Lake Wildwood for over a century was finally over. 4 brave boys had found their peace, countless families had found closure, and an entire region was healing from wounds it had carried for generations. Thomas pulled out the little wooden figure Billy had carved and held it up to catch the last rays of sunset. In the fading light, it almost seemed to move, the tiny diver reaching ever deeper into imaginary depths, forever frozen in the moment of choosing courage over safety. It was a choice Thomas knew he would make again and again, for as long as he drew breath. Some people were meant to be guardians, and Lake Wildwood had found its protector at last. 5 years had passed since the breaking of the curse, and Camp Wildwood had become something of a legend throughout the region. Parents spoke of it as a place where troubled children found peace, where shy kids discovered confidence, and where the magic of childhood seemed to last just a little longer than anywhere else. Thomas, now 29 and the camp's beloved director, stood on the dock watching a new generation of boys enjoy their final evening swim of the summer. The lake remained as clear and beautiful as it had been since that miraculous night in 1925, and the white lilies still bloomed each year, though now only for a single week in August, as if marking an anniversary. Among the swimmers was Billy Peterson, now 15 and working as a junior counselor. The boy who had once seen ghostly figures in the water now helped other children overcome their fears and find joy in the lake's embrace. He caught Thomas's eye and waved, his smile bright with the confidence that came from knowing he had played a part in something extraordinary. "Mr. Mitchell!" called a voice from the shore. Thomas turned to see a young camper, probably around 10 years old, running toward him with obvious excitement. "There's someone here to see you." Thomas made his way back to the main lodge, where he found an unexpected visitor waiting on the front porch. It was Margaret Sinclair, the reporter who had come to investigate the Great Peace 5 years earlier. She looked older now, more refined, but her eyes still held the same intelligent curiosity that had impressed him during their first meeting. "Miss Sinclair," Thomas said, genuinely pleased to see her. "What brings you back to Camp Wildwood?" "Several things, actually." Margaret held up a thick manuscript bound in blue cloth. "I've finally finished my book about the regional phenomena that began here in 1925. I wanted to give you an advance copy before it goes to the publisher." Thomas accepted the manuscript, reading the title, "The Great Peace, a documentation of supernatural healing in rural New York, 1925-1930. His name appeared nowhere on the cover, but he noticed his initials in small print at the bottom. "You didn't identify me directly," he observed. "I kept my promise. You're referred to only as the Guardian throughout the book, but anyone who reads it carefully will understand that someone at this camp performed an act of extraordinary courage that changed the spiritual landscape of an entire region." Margaret settled into one of the porch rockers, accepting the glass of lemonade Thomas offered. "The other reason I came," she continued, "is to tell you about something remarkable that's been happening across the country. Other people have been reading my preliminary articles, and they've started reaching out with similar stories. Cursed places that suddenly found peace, haunted locations that are no longer haunted, families that have found closure after generations of supernatural torment. That's wonderful news. It seems your actions here created a ripple effect that's still spreading. I've documented cases as far away as California and Florida, where people report dreams of reconciliation with lost loved ones, all dating back to the same week in August 1925. Thomas felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced whenever he thought about David, Marcus, Samuel, and Jonathan finding their peace. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've also heard from people who are facing supernatural threats that haven't been resolved. Curses that are still active, spirits that are still trapped. They're asking for help." "What kind of help?" "The kind that only someone with your unique abilities can provide. Someone who can see truth where others see lies, who can remember what others forget, who has the courage to dive into darkness to bring back light." Thomas looked out toward the lake, where the evening sun was painting the water in shades of gold and amber. He had found peace and purpose here at Camp Wildwood, but Margaret's words stirred something deep within him, a sense of responsibility that extended far beyond this single location. "Are you asking me to leave the camp? I'm asking you to consider that your calling might be larger than you realized. There are other Lake Wildwoods out there, other places where children and families are suffering under supernatural curses. You could help them." Before Thomas could respond, Billy Peterson appeared at the top of the porch steps, his face serious with the weight of adolescent wisdom. "Mr. Mitchell, there's something I think you should know," Billy said. "I've been having dreams lately, not scary ones like before, but calling ones. Dreams about a lake in Vermont where kids have been disappearing, and another one in Maine where people hear voices in an old lighthouse." Margaret nodded, pulling out her notebook. "Those match reports I've received. Lake Champlain in Vermont, Pemaquid Point in Maine. Both locations with supernatural activity that fits the pattern you broke here." Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He had always known, deep down, that his experience at Camp Wildwood was preparation for something larger. The 4 boys who had guided him to break their curse had also been preparing him for a life of helping others trapped in similar darkness. "If I were to consider this," Thomas said carefully, "I would need assurance that Camp Wildwood would remain protected." "Already arranged," Margaret replied with a smile. "The families whose relatives you helped in 1925 have established a trust fund to maintain the camp in perpetuity, and Billy has agreed to stay on as the new guardian when he comes of age." Billy nodded solemnly. "I learned from the best, and I've got the sight, just like you. I can make sure nothing bad ever happens here again." Thomas looked at the manuscript in his hands, then at the lake where he had found his purpose, then at the young man who had been his first ally in the fight against supernatural darkness. "I suppose some gifts are meant to be shared," he said finally. That night Thomas walked alone to the dock for what he knew would be his final solitary vigil at Lake Wildwood. As he sat in the familiar silence, watching moonlight dance on the calm water, he felt a presence that had become as natural as breathing. "You approve of this decision?" he asked the empty air. The response came not in words, but in a feeling of warmth and encouragement that seemed to emanate from the lake itself. David, Marcus, Samuel, and Jonathan might have moved on to whatever realm awaited them, but their influence remained, guiding Thomas toward his true destiny. A splash in the water caught his attention, and Thomas looked up to see a single white lily blooming in the moonlight, even though it was not the season for their appearance. As he watched, 3 more lilies bloomed beside it, 4 flowers floating in perfect formation on the still water. Thomas smiled, understanding the message. The 4 boys were telling him that his work here was complete, that he had learned everything they could teach him, and that it was time to carry their gift of courage to other places where hope had been forgotten. The next morning, as Thomas prepared to leave Camp Wildwood for the first time in 5 years, the entire camp gathered to see him off. Current campers mixed with alumni who had returned for the occasion, creating a crowd of children and young men whose lives had been touched by the magic of this place. Billy Peterson, now tall and confident in his role as the camp's new protector, shook Thomas's hand with ceremony. "I'll keep them safe," Billy promised, "all of them for as long as I live." "I know you will," Thomas replied. "And if you ever need help, if anything supernatural ever threatens this place again, you know how to find me." As Thomas's automobile pulled away from Camp Wildwood, he looked back one final time at the lake that had transformed his life. The morning sun was reflecting off its surface like scattered diamonds, and he could swear he saw 4 familiar figures standing waist-deep in the water, waving goodbye. But these weren't the desperate, trapped spirits he had first encountered. These were the images of 4 boys who had grown into the men they were meant to become, visiting from whatever eternal summer awaited those who had found their peace. They were waving not in farewell, but in encouragement, sending their guardian forth to bring the same gift of freedom to others who waited in supernatural darkness. Thomas waved back, then turned his face toward the road ahead. Somewhere in Vermont, children were disappearing near a cursed lake. In Maine, voices called from a haunted lighthouse, and in dozens of other locations across the country, families were suffering under burdens that had been carried for far too long. But now, they had a guardian of their own, someone who had learned from the best teachers imaginable, 4 boys who had chosen to trust in love rather than surrender to fear, and who had shown him that some kinds of magic were stronger than any curse. As his automobile disappeared around a bend in the road, Camp Wildwood settled into its eternal peace, protected by new guardians, but forever watched over by the spirits of courage and compassion that would never truly leave its shores. The summer of 1925 had ended at last, but its legacy would continue for generations to come, carried by a young man who had learned that the greatest adventures begin when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things for the sake of those who cannot help themselves. In the deep, clear waters of Lake Wildwood, 4 white lilies continued to bloom in perfect formation, a reminder that some friendships transcend death itself, and that love, once awakened, never truly dies.